Okay, so the doors are closing. So now we are welcome everybody to the dual plenary session. Our topic today is going to be long-term scenarios, new challenges, new approaches, new results. And something that all of us are experiencing at the moment, that there's a transition, things are changing, we have to be very flexible. And something in electricity systems also is you always have to be N-1 secure and sometimes also N-2, which basically means if something doesn't work, somebody has to jump in to fill in the gap. Therefore also what you're going to see now in this panel discussion is one of these examples how N-1 or N-2 security actually can work. So basically we changed the order of the panelists a bit and also the speakers, as Claudia Kemfert very sadly cannot make it because she has a very important meeting at the ministry at the moment in Germany. So she is very sadly but is not coming. I will instead take her place and hold the presentation later on. So I'm kind of like stepping in there. And then the second news is that Professor Christian von Hirschhausen, who was supposed to chair this session, is also stuck at the airport. He didn't manage to get his flight last night because it was overbooked, and today they had problems with the airplane, so he's basically still stuck at the airport. He might join us later on in the audience, but he will also not be here to chair the audience. So another one drops out, and it's also me taking this place. So I'll be the chair as well as the presenter in one of the later sessions. So I apologize for this, for those people that came for the other two people, but I'm still happy that all of you are here because we have 4 excellent presentations afterwards to a very challenging topic. And therefore I would first, as there's still some people coming in, use the opportunity to do a bit of advertisement. Because actually the session is a very special session because it's linked a bit to this journal you might have heard of, Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy, an IIASA journal, which is focusing a bit more on the environmental aspects, while the Energy Journal is kind of the flagship, focusing on energy and electricity. This is more on environmental policy. And we have a special issue, Access to Electricity, upcoming next year, and we invite all of you to submit your articles to this because I think it's a very challenging topic and we are more than happy if we get additional expert contributions from your side as well. So therefore I would very happy if there would be more submissions from your side for this special issue or also for other issues. Coming now to the next topic, to today's symposium, we said, okay, this EAP journal, it has a tradition of having a symposium in it. So basically each journal consists of some regular articles and then a symposium on a particular topic. And then we asked ourselves, what does a symposium actually mean? If you look up symposium either in the dictionary or at Wikipedia, what you find is actually the Greek origin of the word symposium describes the part of a banquet that took place after the meal when drinking for pleasure was accompanied by music, dancing, recitals or conversations. So actually that's something similar to a conference dinner where after the nice parts, after everything was done, you really start discussing the important aspects over a glass of wine. However, we are not allowed to drink wine in these rooms, but still we want to have some kind of fruitful discussions on excellent topics, and we also think that it's important sometimes to discuss things, to argue a bit, because it's a challenge, it's an energy revolution, energy evolution, it's something we should discuss and we are not necessarily always have the same opinion. So therefore I'm very happy that we managed to bring together this panel, and we will start first of all with Professor Klaus Mohn, who is a professor in petroleum economics at Stavanger University, and he will give his talk on energy scenarios, a review of the IEA's World Energy Outlook. So basically, if you just look back 2 hours ago, there was a presentation from Fatih Tirol on the IEA, and this is going to be a bit more critical analysis from Klaus Mohn, which I think helps very much to reflect about these different kind of aspects. Afterwards, from this scenario perspective, we're going to jump to Volker Krey, who is Deputy Program Director at IIASA, who's going to present a bit the new IIASA modeling approach, where you integrate sustainable development goals into the normal modeling approach. Because even though electricity and energy systems are very important, sometimes there are more aspects that are even more important related to sustainable aspects, social aspects that can be incorporated in these models, and this I think contributes very much to the overall discussion. Continuing from this, me will kind of jump in and give this talk, which was originally given by Claudia Kemfert, modeling large shares of renewable energies in the energy system model, so looking at electricity, transport and heat sector, and proving to you that it's actually technically possible to come up with scenarios in line with the Paris Agreement. Last but not least, Paula Ferreira, professor from the University of Minho, will kind of actually show to you how things are then put into practice in reality, because if we are coming from a modeling perspective, looking at the global scale, she's more looking at electricity supply and demand aspects, market design aspects, which I think are very important, because without these things couldn't be put into practice. So much to say from me from the beginning. Afterwards, I will now leave the floor to the experts who will come one after the other to present their talks. We will be happy to collect some questions directly after the presentations, and then if there's still some room left in the end, to have a panel discussion up front with everybody. So thank you very much for this, and I give the floor to Professor Mohn.
Thank you, Pao-Yu, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to this session. I've really been looking forward to sharing my thoughts with such a distinguished audience, and not to mention the panel. And what a subject we are here to discuss, because the outlook for energy is intriguingly opaque. We face increasing scarcity in a variety of resources, way beyond energy. We depend critically on R&D efforts and technology development, whose outcome is inherently unpredictable. We have seen large price fluctuations due to unforeseen shocks in supply and demand. And last but not least, late developments have reminded us that politics and policy formation will prevail as a dominant source of risk going forward. At the same time, the demand for well-informed decision is perhaps also more pressing than ever. The world keeps pushing its boundaries with continued growth in the global population, in economic activity, and in energy demand. And climate change is a direct consequence of the pace and pattern of historical development, and now calls for firm and coordinated action. Against this background, scenarios for the global energy outlook have a major role to play. Scenarios offer a useful tool for consistent system thinking that also could span important parts of the possibility set. With a focus on foresight instead of forecasting, scenarios should be suited to link outlook uncertainty to flexibility in behavior and to awareness in policy formation. At the same time, scenarios require large amounts of data, highly competent human resources, and the results will be driven not only by methodology and modeling approach, but also by professional judgment and stakeholder involvement. And therefore, it's important that resources are spent not only on the design of these scenarios, but also on the understanding of the background and rationale, and always to build consciousness on the receiving end about the drivers of the results, their predictions, and their implications. So this would sum up some of my own motivations to have a closer look at one of the most prominent suppliers of scenarios in the energy domain, which is the International Energy Agency and their World Energy Outlook. Released at the press conference in London every November, the IEA's WEO has developed into one of the most authoritative sources of energy foresight in less than 20 years. Today, the WEO serves as a key point of reference for policymakers and private industries, and in particular for energy industries. The role of the IEA's WEO in a changing energy landscape is assessed by Van de Graaf 2012. And more recently, Heubaum and Biermann demonstrate how the IEA has contributed to an integration of energy and climate issues in global governance. The World Energy Outlook is an 800-page book, immensely rich in detail across the geographical dimension, across various sectors of supply and demand, and across the spectrum of energy carriers. Although it involves a global model, the WEO draws on the somewhat loose methodology of scenario construction. This approach was surveyed for the energy sector by Nielsen and Carlson 10 years ago, and is increasingly applied, as you must have noticed, for engagement by a wide range of stakeholders. should therefore come as no surprise that the role of the IEA's WEO also attracts interest among academic researchers. As early as the mid-1980s, Midthun and Baumgartner raised concerns about the influence of IEA's member countries on their outlook, their predictions, and their policy advice. And these authors argued that the conclusions of the IEA should be seen as a negotiated coalition of stakeholder interests. More recently, in a qualitative study of last year, Gaden Meadowcraft argued that perceived interests of IEA's member countries and governance systems are consistent with a contender status quo bias in their outlook. I build on this time of literature with my paper, where the aim is to explore how outcomes of the IEA's WEO can be related to their choice of methodology and their modeling strategy. I argue that methodological elements of the IEA's scenario design raise the risk of a status quo bias in their predictions. But before we go on to discuss how this might be the case, let's have a closer look at the model. So this stylized overview illustrates the main structure of IEA's world energy model, with links from energy demand via conversion to required supply. The model divides the world in 25 regions, 12 of which are countries, and the rest is groups of countries. The typical horizon of projections is 25 years, 25 to 30 years, we might say, and we easily see that the number of sectors, countries, and energy products will produce a very detailed outlook for each country. However, these qualities come at a cost, because the accounting structure, the extensive use of exogenous coefficients, and the richness in details make it challenging to reproduce the flexibility and dynamics in economic behavior which is observed among households and companies in the real world. Consequently, there's a risk that the output will owe too much to historical trends and developments, and these are manually adjusted through an endless set of exogenous assumptions and coefficients for economic activity, technological progress, prices, and policy. So how large are these problems? Well, here's the thing, because we can really not tell. Although the documentation of the World Energy Model offers a useful general overview, it reveals only the tip of the iceberg. Consequently, we cannot really assess if elasticities of demand and supply are reasonable for the various products, sectors, and countries. Still, there is a couple of things we do know about the assumption of the IEA's long-term energy scenarios. So let's have a look and see what the potential implications might be. You probably know that the standard approach of the IEA's WEO involves 3 scenarios for the global energy outlook. The current policies outlook, it's characterized by a continuation of today's policies with no further measures implemented, and could therefore be seen as a business as usual scenario. The new policy scenario is presented as IEA's central scenario and assumes that policies evolve according to announced future measures, plans, and stated intentions for the various countries of the world. The 450 scenario is designed as an illustration of what it would take to contain the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to 450 parts per million, which is generally thought of as the maximum level allowed to keep, if global warming is to be limited to 2 degrees Celsius, with a 50% likelihood that is. In all these scenarios, energy demand, as illustrated in the chart here, is driven by assumptions for economic growth, technological progress, structural change, prices, and policies. And as we would expect, the assumptions for policies, prices, structural change, and technological progress also show variation across the scenarios. However, macroeconomic activity does not. With no room for freedom and flexibility across the scenarios, economic growth is given by assumptions that are exogenous and uniform. Not only for the world at large, but for each and every country and region of the outlook. In short, or somewhat simplified, this would suggest that GDP is insensitive to changes in the energy landscape, like oil price fluctuations, like energy-related technological progress, like energy and climate policies. I believe this is unfortunate. And one reason is that the assumption of uniform growth rates disregards the vast body of academic research that has added valuable insight to the energy-economy relationship. Theories of endogenous economic growth links economic progress to R&D investment and human capital formation, which again depends on policy formation, including energy policies. Contributions in empirical macroeconomics have informed the transmission mechanism for oil price shocks to GDP for both oil exporting countries and oil importing countries. And the ultimate impact seems to depend on the nature of the oil price shock in terms of causal origin and persistence. Academic research in energy economics have also added insights on how economic activity could respond to various strategies to meet the challenges of global warming. With uniform economic growth rates, IEA's World Energy Outlook leaves the impression that the 2-degree target can be met without any cost in terms of aggregate economic activity. This is clearly a message which is welcomed by both politicians and businesses, because the alternative is a hard sell both to voters and to shareholders. However, the idea that CO2 emissions can be constrained to meet the 2-degree target with no consequence for economic activity is disputable from the point of academic research. All in all, the assumption of uniform growth rates adds a common constraint to the scenarios, which again will limit the variation between them and therefore also raise the risk of a status quo bias in the outlook. Another part that raises similar suspicions is the modeling of technological progress. New technology is critical to bring about the desired change in the global energy system, and the IEA also stresses that projections of the world energy outlook are highly sensitive to the choice of technology assumptions. Technology is approached through a gradual and deterministic process, with exogenous increments imposed for each sector and region of the model. In this approach, any technological shock or sudden breakthrough is ruled out by default. Consequently, the world energy outlook will tend to be driven by the mean of historical developments, which again would raise a risk of a bias to the status quo. What I would like to see is efforts to endogenize technological development, preferably in a framework allowing for influences by prices, policies, R&D investments, and dynamic scale economies. If such a framework had been adopted by the IEA 10 years ago, I believe they could have improved their projections and possibly also escaped some of the most serious critique that have been raised against the WEO, which has been directed at their projections for wind power and solar energy. IEA's World Energy Model combines historical data with methodology from both engineering and economics to adapt projections for solar energy and wind power to the scenarios of the world energy outlook. S-shaped curves of penetrations are formed on the basis of static resource cost functions combined with ad hoc dynamics. However, the specifics of estimation and calibration is not revealed, so again, the quality of modeling strategy escapes our assessment. Still, an assessment of the actual outlook over the last few years does suggest that the WEO could do with some review and revision at this point. Charts from De Vos and De Jager 2014, as illustrated on my slide, clearly indicate how IEA's central scenario for new renewable energy have been outpaced by real-world developments. I'm going to round off now. The model developed for IEA's long-term strategy is very broad and full of detail. However, these qualities come at a cost. Several choices in the modeling strategy leave the apparatus somewhat short on flexibility. It's no secret that the global energy system is largely sluggish. And so is therefore the data generating process. However, model specifications and assumptions should still allow for flexibility in economic behavior among producers and consumers. My review demonstrates how various choices relating to methodology and modeling gives rise to a status quo bias in the outlook. With limited transparency, we cannot tell whether this is due to model specification and estimation or if it's the result of professional judgment. The latter is probably more influenced by stakeholder interest than the former. I count myself as a keen reader and user of the IEA's WEO. There is certainly a lot to be learned from this resourceful organization and their research, both for academic scholars and their students. At the same time, the growing prominence and influence of the WEO for global governance and policy formation calls for caution. As we have seen, the IEA is not any type of independent research organization. They do represent the particular interests of 29 OECD countries who are heavily invested in a particular type of energy infrastructure. And oil consumption of member countries also feeds directly through to their voting rights. And the World Energy Outlook should therefore be read accordingly. My final advice for the International Energy Agency would therefore be that transparency, active engagement with the academic community, and even peer reviewing of studies and models should be considered in the future development of the research strategy. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Also from my side, my name is Volker Krey. I'm from IIASA, which is actually located quite close, about 15 kilometers south of here. Before I'm going to start with the presentation, I would like to thank the organizers for the possibility of presenting here. I'm going to talk about integrating the climate change assessment and the broader sustainable development agendas. This is work not only done by myself, but there are a lot of colleagues, some of which are listed here. So let me, with that said, directly jump into the presentation. Okay. These are the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure all of you are aware of them. There are 17 in total. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but we'll pick a few examples to highlight interactions where in particular policies that affect the energy system have the potential to either create synergies or result in trade-offs with some of the other related sustainable development goals. I think in a nutshell, one of the important points to realize when doing analysis in this in this research domain is that within the SDGs there are really two types of agendas embedded. The one is the human security agenda that affects topics like poverty eradication or addressing hunger. And on the other hand, there is the planetary boundaries agenda, to which certainly climate change, but also maintaining intact ecosystems and so on and so forth belong. And the challenge really is to balance policies across these two agendas, or that address one or the other, and make sure they become synergistic rather than becoming competitive. As an entry point for the analysis, I'll take the Paris Agreement and action in the climate change domain. We've already heard in the presentations this morning quite a bit on this. And let me start out with, showing you a few projections which you may have already seen, or at least seen similar ones. Here is an assessment of how global greenhouse gas emissions may evolve over the next couple of decades without any specific climate policies in place. It's clearly a counterfactual, given that we have quite a few policies that are geared towards reducing emissions in place. And taking these into account, the situation looks actually already a bit better. Then on top of that, as you are aware of, the Paris Agreement has called for pledges to increase the ambition level beyond current policies and to reduce emissions further. These are the so-called nationally determined contributions, and there are lots of assessment, scenario and otherwise out there that indicate that we may expect another ballpark 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions reduction compared to what current policies may deliver by 2030. However, if we're talking about achieving in a cost-effective way the 2-degree target, not to speak of the 1.5-degree target, there is a very large gap opening up. The question is how to address that gap. And the question that I'm going to address here is, because there is already quite a bit of research on that, is how to make sure we can address this gap and avoid detrimental impacts on other sustainable development priorities that are out there. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on a subset where we have done quite a bit of research, taking again climate action as the entry point, and then looking how the interactions with other SDGs, namely the zero hunger, the good health and well-being. Here I'm going to focus on air pollution in particular, clean water and sanitation, and the affordable and clean energy SDG, how these unfold. What this means in reality, or from the perspective of an assessment, we need different types of models and need to integrate those. On the one hand, the most predominant species probably at this conference are energy economic models that relate to SDG 7 and 13. Then we need a representation of land use to address hunger, so the production side of agriculture, air quality models to assess the impacts of air pollution from the energy sector and other human activities, and then hydroeconomic models to think about actions related to clean water and sanitation. Let me start with air pollution and health. That's probably the topic that has been studied the most, and there is robust evidence that climate policies have generate significant co-benefits with air pollution or air quality, and therefore improving also the health aspects of air pollution. What you see here is from a multi-model assessment. The results are still in the making, so the numbers may change, but I don't expect the insights to change dramatically. So what you see here is in a no policy scenario, so in a no climate policy scenario, I should be very specific here because there is air quality legislation included in these projections. how black carbon emissions and sulfur emissions both are important contributors to direct and indirect formation of particulate matter 2.5, one of the most important air quality measure when it comes to health impacts. So we see, due to existing air quality policies, an improvement here across the range of models. Now, adding on top of that different climate policies, starting with the NDCs, and then a transition towards 2 and 1.5 degree scenarios results in significant improvement of the emission levels that I'm showing here. This is this co-benefit effect is stronger for sulfur emissions. Sulfur is mostly originating from combustion of coal, and coal is the first energy carrier to be phased out under stringent climate policy. Black carbon emissions to some degree also benefit because combustion processes are generally replaced by others. If one looks at the regional decomposition, so if we project this out to 2050, we see quite significant differences to which degree some of these co-benefits already play out when implementing the NDCs. For example, in the European Union, hard to see because the contribution is overall very small. A lot of the co-benefits already play out with the NDCs being implemented, while other regions, for example, Russia up here, where the NDCs are much less ambitious, the co-benefits only play out in a transition towards emissions that are consistent with 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Now, emission levels as such don't tell us much about the adverse side effects of them or the adverse impacts of them. That looked a little bit different when I was looking at it on my laptop. Okay. I still hope you're going to get the main message. What this is, it shows ambient concentrations of particulate matter 2.5 in China to make this a little bit more tangible. The hotspots here are in the range of exceeding 100 micrograms per square meters. To put this into context, and this is the Beijing area. I'm sure everybody has read about air pollution problems in Beijing. To put this into context, the WHO in its air quality guidelines aims at annual average concentration of PM2.5 below 10 micrograms per cubic meter. So we are talking here about a more than 10-fold exceedance of this, and even the interim target, which still is associated with significant health implications, is at 35 micrograms, so also far away from what we are seeing somewhere. So if we look now or move over to a 2-degree policy scenario and let that play out by 2050, the situation looks actually significantly better here. But there are still hotspots with emissions in the 70, 80 microgram range, and that is 35 years from now. That actually tells us that while there are synergies and co-benefits to be expected from climate policy, more action is needed to address the health impacts. Translating these concentrations, which, if I compare the 2010 numbers with the 2050 2-degree policy scenario, we do see on average a significant decrease in concentrations. That actually corresponds still to an increase in mortality. So the health impact, despite making the physical or the environmental situation better, is increasing, and that is due to implied demographic change, namely aging. An aging population will be more vulnerable, and that stresses that there's actually significantly more action needed when it comes to air quality and health objective. That brings me to the next topic, access to clean energy. Actually quite related. This is of high relevance in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia. I'm going to show you some analysis in South Asia, where there's more than 1 billion people relying on solid cooking fuels, with again a lot of household air pollution and significant adverse health impacts, another 500 million people without access to electricity. What you see here is useful energy for cooking. That's the predominant energy service that relies on solid fuels. This is based on household survey data or household survey information. You see here this useful energy demand split by rural and urban households and divided into income quartiles. What pops out is that in particular low-income rural households almost exclusively rely on solid cooking fuels and therefore suffer from these health impacts. So here it's important to really take into account socioeconomic heterogeneity rather than just modeling the average household or the average consumer, which when it comes to exposure to household level air pollution doesn't really exist. So when projecting this out with a relatively optimistic economic development projection, we can expect to see the fraction of population in South Asia that relies on solid fuels going significantly down. However, the ambition set by the SDGs, the ambition level set by the SDGs in 2030 is to eradicate energy poverty and move away from traditional cooking fuels by 2030. So this is far from what autonomous economic development will deliver. On top of that, if we now add climate policy in, climate policy makes, by construction, modern energy carriers, fossil or renewable alternatives, more expensive to discourage their use, and that may lead to low-income rural households being pushed back into the use of traditional fuels. So, and if one does the math and estimates the health impacts, that would lead to roughly 500,000 additional deaths induced by single-minded climate policy in 2030 per year in South Asia. So what this calls for is adding additional supplementary policies that make sure that poor households can still afford a transition from traditional fuels to modern fuels. The cost estimates for these are actually quite modest compared to what the decarbonization of the energy system would cost. However, it possibly involves measures, such unpopular measures as for at least subsets of the population allowing subsidies for modern fuels, as well as enabling them to purchase devices or modern cooking stoves and so on and so forth for adopting these fuels. The next topic is actually quite related. Food security also has a strong distributional component. For 2005, the FAO estimates some 800 million people at risk of hunger. How this will develop in the future again depends on economic development, on how institutions, in particular in developing countries, will develop. And what you see here is a very large, significant range that relates to some of these socioeconomic uncertainties, how the number of people at risk of hunger will play out in the future. But what we're interested in the study is actually what is the incremental effect of climate policy on this population at risk of hunger. So if the climate policy is narrow-minded and doesn't take into account the needs of low-income households in developing countries, we may actually see a significant increase in the population at risk induced by climate policy. That's for basically three reasons. On the one hand, agriculture by itself is fairly greenhouse gas intensive, therefore any climate policy, any pricing mechanism would make food products more expensive. Second, if bioenergy is going to be an important source of decarbonization of the energy system, there's competition over land, which again drives prices up. And thirdly, because consumption in general is going to be affected by climate policy, there is an income effect, which also has an implication for the ability to purchase food. So also here, we would need inclusive climate policies that shield poor households from these impacts. Let me just briefly say a few words on the next topic in the interest of time. Water is a multifaceted and a very regional context. Some regions don't have water issues, others have significant water issues. This is a map that shows groundwater sustainability. Let me pick out a couple of regions. So the southwest of the United States, the Arabian Peninsula or the Upper Ganges region suffer significant issues with from groundwater sustainability. And that's something that the energy sector will need to take into account when addressing climate change, but also otherwise. So what you see here is a large range of energy-related thermal water pollution, mostly from power plant cooling. The interesting thing is this large envelope is all from 2 degrees consistent scenarios. So these scenarios are all compatible from a greenhouse gas perspective with achieving the 2-degree target, yet they are very, very different in terms of how the portfolio of technologies translates into the use of water resources. For example, if heavily relying on nuclear or carbon capture and storage, which can be very water intensive, and we may find ourselves more on top here, if we instead rely heavily on energy efficiency measures in the end-use sectors and non-combustible forms which don't require cooling water, then this increase in water use or thermal water pollution can be moderated significantly. Let me skip the next 2 slides and come to my conclusions. So to assess implications of energy and climate policies on broader sustainable development goals, it is necessary to link different modeling approaches as well as rely on empirical research. In particular, distributional issues are important to be addressed here. For those areas where this analysis has been done, we find significant co-benefits as well as adverse side effects of climate policies, or climate and energy policies, I should more broadly say. There is definitely more analysis required to identify conditions under which these materialize, given that many of the SDGs really play out at the local scale. So country level and even sub-country level analysis is required here, and effective policies with a holistic policy design are really needed to avoid these adverse side effects of climate policy, which is also very important for having acceptability of climate and energy policies in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your insightful agenda. Yeah, I don't know well about your details of your numbers and other things, but I think that numbers might be from the economic growth will maintain or higher than current economic growth, 3 or 4%. So. However, some books and some economists insist that no more evolution would be in our world, so this growth rate will be decreased. Well, how about you, and what do you think about this opinion?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, as far as the economic projections that underlie these types of analysis concern, they all are consistent with this observation of growth tending to slow down with economic development. So there's usually a growing out of agricultural states, industrialization, where growth rates then strongly increase, and then thereafter with increasing development decrease and essentially go closer towards zero. So from that perspective, I don't think there is a major dispute here. We have done significant sensitivity analysis using the so-called shared socioeconomic pathways. This is a set of socioeconomic projections that cover factors such as demographic development, how education will develop into the future, and the impacts that these factors have also on economic growth. And we, from a ordinal perspective, we find these insights to be robust, yet the magnitude, of course, depends heavily on, the magnitude of some of the effects I've shown you depends heavily on the specific assumptions that you made. So I think while the insights as such are robust, one will need to have a closer look at the specific growth rates that unfold. So for instance, the analysis that I've shown you about energy poverty, to which degree autonomous economic development will autonomously improve the situation with regard to the use of traditional fuels. This will heavily depend on to which degree we will see economic growth to continue.
Good morning, everybody. It's now my pleasure to take over the chair. Unfortunately, I had 2 issues with Air Berlin this morning and yesterday night. But fortunately, we are N-2 secure, like all electricity networks are. So N-2 means that Professor Claudia Kemfert, who's on the program and who heads the economic unit of the German Council on Environmental Policy, was called very shortly, at very short notice, to the State Secretary today, because there's an important issue to be resolved within the Council. So she sent her assistant colleague, my colleague Pao-Yu, who actually has 2 other hats, one from TU Berlin and one from DIW Berlin, who's going to give the presentation on behalf of Claudia Kemfert. And so the floor is yours on large shares of renewables in global energy system. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So now it's again my turn to talk a bit about this presentation, and I'm happy for all the insights that have already been given by the other experts beforehand, and I can draw from these conclusions and present a bit our outline from the work that we have done in our work group at the moment. We are working on a model which is called Genesis Mod, and it's my pleasure to present to all of you this new modeling insights, which actually show that 1.5 degree scenarios are possible with 100% renewables until 2050. So this is the good news. Basically, it is technically possible. I'm not saying that it is not challenging and that we have a lot of things ahead, and this energy revolution will be a very challenging aspect, continuing to be our daily work for the next 30 years. But still, I think we are quite good in shape at the moment already. So starting off with an introduction, normally if you look at the world energy outlook some decades ago, it has been pointed out, there has always been like a combination of fossil fuels, at some certain point fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, and then nuclear energy, which managed to be in line with certain decarbonization targets. However, in the last years we've seen a growth of renewable energies that most of the outlooks didn't expect, and we've seen storage potentials, demand-side management, and additional flexibility options that we couldn't dream of only 2 or 3 years ago. So this is why we are very happy that so many things are happening. We are, as it was said before in the presentations, not happy that there's not enough research and development, but still I think that there is already some research going on and we want to contribute to this. However, you can still see that in the academic literature there's a debate on how far renewables are able to fulfill this electricity system without the help of any balancing technologies such as coal or gas or nuclear. And therefore you've seen, for example, maybe in the literature, there was an article by Clark et al. Evaluation of a proposal for 100 renewables-based electricity system, which was very critical. and then a direct response again by Jacobson et al., which basically proves that the claims were false that were being made and that it is actually possible to come up with a 100% renewable energy-based system for the US, but also for some other countries. So this is just an ongoing debate currently in the academia, which we would like to contribute to, and this is why we in this scenario that I will present actually prove and also show for the global energy system that it is possible to base this on 100% renewable energies. Our model can be grouped as a techno-economic optimization model similar to Markle Times family, and it's actually built on the Osmosis platform. Some of you might know the Osmosis community from the KTH in Stockholm. It's actually a great project what they've been doing in the last years, and the most amazing thing about it that it's all open source. So basically the biggest advantage for our work group was that 2 years ago we were looking at which kind of models exist. Would we like to make another Times version for Germany maybe, and then we kind of found Osmosis and we're very happy that it's open coded and that we could adopt it basically to a GAMS version and then kind of run certain scenarios with it. Of course there's a lot of work linked to adjusting the model and then coming up with different settings, coming up with sufficient data, as most of you know. However, I'm proud to present to you now the new Genesis Global Energy System Model, which is a version of the Osmosis modeling community and is also open source and will be publicly available for everybody. At the moment, what you can find already is our DW discussion paper with all the data and all the codes and all the information, and all the other information will go online in the next months. What is our modeling actually incorporating? We have different kind of renewable technologies which we have focused kind of, but we also have some fossil technologies, and most important we are looking at the electricity sector where we have to meet the demand, but also at the heating sector and at the transport sector. We are not as good as the IIASA, which is also looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, but we are at least trying not only to look at electricity, but also at heat and transport, because we think that it's very difficult to come up with a decarbonization pathway until 2050 if you're not incorporating heat and transport, because due to sector coupling effects, there are enormous interlinkages which need to be incorporated properly. And even though we are continuously working on this, we're quite proud of what we've done until now. Basically, the results that I'm showing to you today is kind of some results from a global model run with 10 regions, time horizon until 2050 in 5-year steps, and we have the different kind of sectors. However, we have a limited number of time slices, so therefore there's additional further research needed from our side as well as from other modeling perspective. However, we are still sure that you can draw certain conclusions from this minor model. In general, we looked at 2 main scenarios, because even though scenarios such as current policies and new policies are somehow helpful because some people would consider them to be the most realistic versions, we like to consider especially scenarios which we really want to aim at and what really would be needed. So if we take Paris seriously, if we want to reduce climate change, if we want to reduce the enormous effects by climate change, then we have to be in line either with a 2-degree target or even better with a 1.5-degree target, knowing that this will be very difficult and tough for us. But it is our job as academics to kind of show that it is possible, or to examine under which cost things would be possible or what would be needed to fulfill these targets that the international community at least agreed to. So therefore we have these 2 scenarios, 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we are looking at the electricity system, heating and transport sector in these 2 scenarios. Now I will just try to run with you through some of the basic model results, but you can also look them up online in the paper. So therefore this is just a short overview. So basically looking at this, you can see the energy demand, so for electricity, heat and transport evolving from 2015 until 2050. The entire energy demand in total stays more or less the same because we assume energy efficiency gains in many sectors, even though there is of course a growing population and growing wealth in many countries. What you can see is that coal and especially also gas is being phased out in the 20s and 30s, as due to the CO2 constraint that we have in line, there's no room for fossil fuels anymore. Also, due to our settings, we are kind of showing that for this 2 degrees Celsius in 2050, we are relying nearly only on renewables. And if you look at the 1.5 degree Celsius scenario, you can see in 2050 that actually there's no more fossils, there's no nuclear, there's no CCS, so it's 100% renewable energy sources, balanced through storage, etc., demand side management as such. What you can also see is that the biggest shares kind of have solar, wind, and then a bit of biomass. Biomass not being used in the electricity sector, but in the heating and the transport sector. So this is something you always have to be a bit cautious about. If you look at the electricity sector, which most of you focus on, you will see that there's a huge increase of need for electricity, not because people use more electricity, but it's mostly because the other sectors are being coupled to the electricity sector. So what we observe here is that the demand for electricity might be 3 times as high, maybe even higher, depending on the kind of efficiency gains that we assume. You can also see that there's an early phase out of coal, particular happening, and then also of gas. What you can see again, wind and PV have the major share. If we look from power generation now, which kind of renewables are positioned in which kind of region in the world? Because you might say, okay, the potential of Russia is of course different than from India. And if you look at this, you can see that India, for example, is mostly basing it on renewables, particular PV, while in the northern hemisphere you're more concentrating on wind simply due to the geographical potential that we have included in the different regions. As I said, we're not only examining the electricity sector, but we're also looking at the heating sector. And therefore, in the heating sector, you can see coal is of major importance in many countries, and it's very difficult to kind of phase it out. However, if you want to be in line with the climate target, you have to phase it out at some point, and then might kind of decide to replace it with biomass. However, of course, being careful when using biomass of the used land, which kind of biomass you're using, and that you're not getting into contradictory targets with this SDGs, which you have to keep in mind. Looking at the transport sector here, it's the freight transport sector, where we also have passenger transport in the model. You can see that everything is currently mostly based on road conventional, and as was pointed out in the panel this morning, trucks, of course, is a huge important aspect that we have to take care of, and these things might then be replaced either by biomass or also by electric masses, depending a bit. It's a bit more complicated for ships as well as airplanes due to the density that you need, so you might need some power to X aspects here, which will then be linked to electricity produced from renewable energies, mostly wind and PV, depending on the regions where you're coming from. We are talking a lot about the climate, and therefore CO2 emissions might be the most important aspect that we want to talk about. If you want to be in line with the 2-degree scenario or with the 1.5-degree scenario, you have to consider who is allowed to emit the last amounts of CO2. Should it be coal, should it be gas, or should it be oil? And something that is very clear is that coal is the most CO2 intensive, so the longer it takes to phase out coal, the less space you have for gas and oil. This is mainly the main message. And what you can see in our scenarios, 2-degree scenario, is that coal is still using up the major share of CO2 emission, which is mostly due to CO2 emissions in the heating sector, which are difficult to phase out, especially in the Southeast Asia for the next decades. Natural gas see an increase in the early on because due to a change of technology you can reduce emissions at the beginning. However, in the long run there's no space for gas either due to the CO2 constraint. Something that is very interesting is if you look at the involvement of CO2 emissions in the 2-degree scenario compared to the 1.5-degree scenario, which is down right at the bottom, you can see the biggest change is in 2025 and 2030. So basically, if we want to be in line with 1.5 degrees, we have to act fast. If we don't manage in the 2020s and 2030 to reduce emissions sharply, it's impossible to reach the 1.5-degree target. And this is why it's important to start with early action now, as in some sectors, such as the heating sector, it takes quite some time to push through these different kind of technologies. So therefore, we observe in our model runs, which are based on a minimized cost optimization, that 30% less CO2 would be emitted in 2025 and 2030, and there's a much smaller share remaining for coal, especially in the heating sector. And very interesting, if you look at overall system costs that we incorporated in the model, the general costs in total, they increase, but they don't increase so much due to the fact that renewables at a certain point have become so cheap, and therefore it is not such a big problem from the cost. It might be also from acceptance issues, other social aspects which you have to incorporate, which are not included in the model, but therefore the cost increase from 2 to 1.5 degrees Celsius actually does not take place in our model runs. If you look at costs in general per LCOE costs, so per produced amount of electricity overall throughout the entire system, you can see that the costs, of course, they vary for each region, they vary for each technology, they vary for each year, but summing them up as a summary, we can see that PV costs, according to our cost estimates, go down quite a lot, and therefore sum up the cheapest cost potential for the regions where PV is available sufficiently. So for some other regions, wind onshore might be a good solution, as well as some wind offshore potentials to balance out hours with little wind onshore and PV. Hydro is relatively cheap still, however has very limited potential for most regions, and the average costs in total are in the range of 4 cents per kilowatt hours on average. However, we have to say that we do not include any additional infrastructure or system costs, so transmission lines or additional flexibility options. Some of them would cause, of course, additional costs. However, these costs would also occur if we have a system based on conventional energy systems, which have to be transformed. Key insights, as we also have done some sensitivity analysis